A nurse finishes a double shift at 6 in the morning, pulls up her pay stub on the drive home, and watches the math happen in real time. Gross pay, one number. Net pay, a smaller number, already gone before she ever touched it, sliced away by the time she clocked out. Federal tax, state tax, Social Security, Medicare, each lying quietly doing its job before she's even had coffee. She felt every hour of that shift in her legs, her feet, the small of her back. She'll never feel the moment the tax came out, because there wasn't a moment. It was automatic, instant, non-negotiable, decided by someone she's never met, on a form she signed once and never thought about again. Somewhere else that same morning, a technology founder checks a brokerage app before breakfast and watches his net worth climb by more than that nurse will earn in her entire career, in the time it takes his coffee to brew. He didn't work for it today. He didn't do anything at all today. And unless he chooses to sell a single share, the government will not touch $1 of it, not this year, maybe not for decades, maybe not ever. Same country. Same tax code. Same government cashing both of their checks, or refusing to. That's the contradiction this entire video is built on, and once you see it, it's genuinely hard to unsee. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why that's legal, and exactly which 7 rules make it possible, because once you know all 7, you'll never read your own pay stub the same way again. Here's the number that makes that feeling official. Between 2014 and 2018, 25 of the richest people in America added $401 billion to their combined fortune. Over that same 5 years, they paid $13.6 billion in federal income tax, a real tax rate of 3.4%. In that same stretch, a typical household earning around $70,000 a year paid 14%, 4 times the rate, on a fraction of the money. One ordinary family actually watched their net worth grow by about $65,000 over those 5 years, and paid nearly that same amount, roughly $62,000, in federal taxes alone, just to stay in place. None of that was a mistake, a scandal, or a crime. Every dollar of it was completely legal, filed on paperwork the IRS itself processed. Which is somehow worse. The wealthy aren't cheating at this game. They're playing a version of it most people have never even seen the rulebook for. Ask yourself honestly, when's the last time anyone explained to you why that's allowed? Not just that it happens, but why the law is actually written that way. If you can't answer that, you're not alone. Almost nobody can, and that's not an accident either. Here's the question worth carrying through the rest of this video. Was that rulebook actually written for them specifically, or has it been sitting out in the open the entire time, waiting for anyone willing to read past page 1? Stick around, because the answer changes depending on which of the next 7 pages you're standing on: taxes, businesses, capital gains, assets, debt, equity, and wealth preservation. Start with taxes, because the divergence begins in the very first sentence of how the system defines income, buried in language so dry almost nobody ever reads it twice. A dollar earned from labor gets taxed the moment it lands, at rates climbing as high as 37%. A dollar earned from an asset simply growing in value isn't legally considered income at all, not until the asset is sold. 2 people, same rulebook, except one of them was handed a walkthrough on page 1, and the other was never told a walkthrough existed. That nurse's entire paycheck was written by Rule 1. The founder's fortune is being written by Rule 2, in real time, while he sleeps. Businesses are where Rule 2 starts working in someone's favor on purpose. Picture 2 people who each spend $12,000 this year on a laptop, home internet, and mileage. One is an employee, and that $12,000 comes entirely out of an after-tax paycheck, money the IRS already took its cut from. The other runs a small business, and that same $12,000 gets subtracted from revenue before a single dollar of tax gets calculated. Same laptop. Same $12,000. One version came from money already taxed. The other came from money that hadn't been touched yet. There's a reason most employees never think to ask which order their own money moves in. A paycheck arrives already processed, the decision made upstream, before it ever reaches a bank account. There's nothing to question because nothing was ever left to decide. That's not ignorance. That's a system engineered to never present the choice at all. Quick question, and be honest, have you ever actually looked at your own pay stub and asked why every single line disappears before you even see the number? Most people haven't. There was never a reason to. Nobody ever handed them a version where the order could be different. But businesses are still small potatoes compared to what's coming. The laptop trick saves a few $1,000s a year. The next rule saves billions, and it's the exact reason a founder's coffer brewing fortune from the opening never once triggers a tax bill. Keep that feeling in mind, because it's about to get sharper. Capital gains is where the gap between Rule 1 and Rule 2 turns into a canyon, and one real number makes it impossible to look away from. Long-term capital gains top out at 20%, nearly half the top rate on wages. But the rate was never even the real advantage. It's the timing. Nothing is owed until the asset is actually sold, which means it can climb for 10, 20, 30 years, completely untaxed, compounding on the full amount instead of on whatever survives a yearly tax bill. Imagine that nurse's tax bill simply never arriving, year after year, decade after decade, only ever coming due the one time she personally decides to cash out. That's not a fantasy for the founder. It's just Tuesday. Here's how far that stretches in practice. In 2007, one of the most recognizable founders in the country watched his personal fortune grow by roughly $3.8 billion over 12 months. His federal income tax bill that year, $0. Not low. $0. No mistake, no audit failure, no clever accountant exploiting a gap. His wealth simply never took a form the tax code was built to see. It sat entirely in stock that was never sold, in a column the IRS has no jurisdiction over until someone decides to cash it in. Read that again if you need to. $0. This is exactly the mechanism behind that 3.4% figure from the opening. Nobody was hiding income. Most of it never became income in the first place. Sit with that for a second, because it should feel unfair before it starts feeling explainable. Now here's where it gets stranger, because eventually even a fortune that's never taxed has to become spendable cash somehow. A yacht doesn't get purchased in unrealized gains. So how does anyone actually live off a fortune they're not allowed to touch without a tax bill attached? This is where the documentary earns its title, because what happens next isn't a workaround whispered between lawyers behind closed doors. It's not a loophole discovered by accident. It's a strategy with an actual name, sitting in plain sight for 30 years, taught in law schools, printed in academic journals, built from two words most people have heard their whole lives without ever once being told to put them together. There are exactly two things the federal government does not tax: an asset that hasn't been sold, and a loan. That fact alone is the entire strategy. Buy appreciating assets. Instead of selling them, and triggering the very tax that owning them was supposed to avoid, borrow against them, using the stock or the real estate itself as collateral. Loan proceeds have never once been taxed as income, and current law doesn't touch them. Say it slowly and it sounds almost too simple to be legal. It is legal. It has been for decades. Picture the mechanics at human scale first, because this is where the unfairness actually lives. A family facing an emergency, a medical bill, a car repair, a month where the rent and the groceries don't both fit, borrows on a credit card at 22% interest, or takes a payday loan that compounds even faster, because a credit card and a payday loan are the only kind of borrowing against the future available to someone with no appreciating collateral to offer a bank. Now picture someone holding $1 million in stock who needs $200,000 in cash. Sell the shares, and $50,000 or more disappears into capital gains tax. Borrow against the exact same shares instead, through a line of credit most major banks will approve within days, often at a rate lower than a car loan, and $200,000 arrives with no tax bill attached at all, while the original million keeps compounding, untouched, in the market. Both of these are technically just debt, the same word, filled out on similar-looking paperwork. One of them is a trap that gets more expensive every month it isn't paid off. The other is a withdrawal button with no tax attached to pressing it. The market for exactly this kind of lending has grown into the hundreds of billions of dollars, with some of the country's largest wealth management firms reporting the volume of these loans doubling in just a few years. This has become genuinely controversial, argued about on the floor of the Senate, where lawmakers have pushed to close it, describing a tax code that lets working families pay out of every paycheck while a separate set of rules applies at the top. At least one billionaire has publicly denied ever using the strategy at all in a televised interview, insisting he didn't recognize the description being put to him. Whether any specific person uses it or not, the mechanism itself isn't in dispute by anyone on any side of that argument. It's written directly into the law, available to anyone with enough appreciating collateral to qualify, regardless of whether they've ever heard the phrase buy, borrow, die spoken out loud in their life. And then comes the final word in the strategy's name, the one that turns a clever tax deferral into something closer to a permanent erasure, die. When someone passes away holding an appreciated asset, their heirs don't inherit the original purchase price. They inherit it at its current market value, a full reset called the step-up in basis. Picture stock bought decades ago for $50,000, now worth $500,000. Sell it while alive, and the tax bill lands on that $450,000 of growth, the entire lifetime of appreciation. Die holding it instead, and heirs can sell the very next day for the same $500,000 and owe precisely zero capital gains tax. Every dollar of appreciation, gone. For tax purposes, the instant ownership changes hands through inheritance instead of a sale. Nobody has to file for it, ask for it, or even understand it's happening. The law does it automatically, the same day the obituary runs. This isn't some recent discovery either. It's been sitting quietly in the tax code for close to a century, surviving decades of reform completely untouched, because unwinding it would mean taxing grief on a schedule nobody in Washington has ever wanted to be the one to write. Buy, borrow, die. 3 words, and a family fortune can move across generations, having paid less in total tax than that nurse paid on a single year of double shifts. Equity is what makes the entire loop possible in the first place, because it changes what compensation looks like at the top. A founder isn't paid in dollars that get taxed on arrival. They're paid in ownership that grows silently in the background, invisible to the tax code for as long as it stays unsold. An employee's raise shows up on a pay stub and gets taxed within 2 weeks, celebrated over dinner, spent within the month. A founder's equivalent raise, the stock climbing another few percent overnight, shows up nowhere the IRS is watching at all, celebrated by no one, because it isn't even a headline. It's a Tuesday. Billionaires and near-billionaires in America are currently sitting on trillions of dollars in exactly that kind of unrealized gain, wealth real enough to borrow against, invisible enough to never owe a dollar on. Breathe for a second here, because the next part is where all 6 of these rules finally converge into one final move, and it might be the coldest one in this entire video. Which brings this full circle to wealth preservation, because the rules just shifted again, dramatically, in the wealthy's favor, and almost nobody outside a trust attorney's office noticed it happen. Legislation signed in the middle of 2025 permanently raised the federal estate tax exemption to $15 million per person, $30 million for a married couple, effective at the start of 2026, indexed to keep rising every year after that. A business owner can place $15 million of company shares into a trust for their children today. Grown at an ordinary 7% a year, that stake is worth roughly $58 million 2 decades later, every dollar of the $43 million in growth sitting entirely outside the taxable estate. Meanwhile, picture a different family, a few states over, arguing in a hospital hallway about how to split a paid-off house and a small savings account after a parent passes, the entire inheritance already taxed once at the register, once on the paycheck, and possibly a final time by the state before it reaches anyone's hands. Both families are grieving. Only one of them is also losing money to a set of rules the other family will never have to think about. Let that sit for a moment before moving on. Not the number. The hallway. Step back and look at all 7 pieces side by side. The pattern has nothing to do with cleverness or secrecy. Wages get taxed the moment they're earned, no exceptions, no negotiation, no delay. Ownership gets taxed only when its holder chooses to sell it, on a calendar nobody else controls. The wealthy aren't playing the same game better. They're playing an entirely different game, on a different part of the board, where timing is a decision they get to make instead of a rule imposed on them the same day, every 2 weeks, for 40 years straight. That's the part worth sitting with longer than a headline usually allows. It was never really about how much money either person had in a given year. It was about which side of the rulebook that money was standing on. So here's the only question left, the one this entire video has been circling since the opening scene: which side is your money standing on right now, and did you even know there were 2 sides to choose from? None of this is available at billion-dollar scale to most people watching this, and it shouldn't be presented as though it is. But the underlying structure scales down further than most people assume. A retirement account is the everyday version of tax-deferred growth, letting an investment compound for decades before the IRS ever collects a cent, the same core mechanism as the founder's untouched fortune, just wearing a smaller, government-approved outfit. A small side business, even a modest one selling something out of a garage, unlocks the same expense before tax ordering available to any Fortune 500 company, on whatever revenue that business brings in. Holding an investment past a year instead of selling early captures the same long-term rate a billionaire's family office is using, at whatever dollar amount you actually have, no minimum net worth required, no lawyer needed to sign off. A basic trust, or simply naming beneficiaries correctly on the accounts you already have, borrows the same principle behind the estate exemption, deciding on purpose how and when assets pass to the people who matter, instead of leaving it to default rules that optimize for absolutely no one. None of these require millions of dollars. They require knowing the second rulebook exists at all, which, until this video, most people genuinely didn't, because nobody in their life was ever paid to sit them down and explain it. Talk to an actual tax professional before making any specific move, because thresholds shift and what applies to one income rarely applies cleanly to another. But carry the 2 questions the wealthy ask about every dollar, questions almost nobody asks while thinking purely in salary. Does this dollar arrive as a wage, taxed the instant it lands, or as ownership, taxed only when I decide? And can more of what I hold move to the second side of that question instead of the first, one account, one decision, one held a little longer investment at a time? Picture that nurse one more time, years from now, still clocking double shifts, still watching the same automatic deduction hit before she ever sees the number, her whole working life recorded in exact, time-stamped detail by a government that never once let her decide when to pay it. And picture the founder, older now, sitting somewhere quiet, who never sold a single share. One ordinary morning, he is simply gone, the way everyone eventually is. Nobody taxes him on the way out. There's no exit bill, no final settling of accounts. The stock he never touched simply changes hands, resets to zero, and starts the entire story over again in someone else's name, as if the growth of an entire lifetime had never happened at all. Two people. 2 lifetimes of the exact same effort to build something that lasts. Only one of them ever finds out, before it's too late to matter, that there were 2 sets of rules the whole time. Which one did you just realize you've been playing?